The data crystal hummed softly in High Keeper Soral's wrinkled hand, its blue light flickering across his pale gray fingers. He had held this crystal every morning for 63 years. It contained the founding myth of the Velnari people, dated precisely 12,040 years old. The oldest recorded story in the known galaxy, or so he had always believed. The Velnari archive fleet drifted slowly past a dead red star, its 7 ships shaped like long curving petals of dark metal. Inside the largest ship, Soral sat in his private chamber, preparing for a meeting that would change everything. A small human transport vessel had been found earlier that day, damaged and drifting near the dead star. The humans had asked for repairs. Soral had agreed, and now he was preparing to greet their envoy in the customary Velnari manner. He smoothed his ceremonial robes and walked slowly to the great hall. His assistants, all younger historians, followed behind him with quiet respect. Soral was nearly 200 years old. His species lived long, and he had spent most of his life cataloging legends, songs, and stories. He believed deeply that the Velnari held the oldest memory in the galaxy. Other species often came to learn from his people. He expected today to be no different. The doors of the great hall slid open. A small group of humans stood waiting, dressed in dark blue uniforms. At the front was a woman of medium height, with short brown hair and tired eyes. Her face carried small scars near her left ear. She bowed slightly, in a polite but unfamiliar way. "I am Captain Reyna Holt," she said. Her voice was calm and steady. "Thank you for receiving us, High Keeper." Soral raised his thin hand in a gentle greeting. He studied her face carefully. She looked perhaps 40 human years old, which by Velnari standards was very young. He had read reports about humans. They were a fast-growing species, only recently expanding into deep space. He assumed their culture was a few centuries old at most. "Welcome, Captain Holt," Soral said warmly. "Please, sit with me. It is our tradition to share our oldest stories with new visitors. I am sure you will find ours fascinating." Captain Holt nodded politely and sat down across from him. Her crew remained standing behind her, quiet and respectful. Soral lifted the blue data crystal and placed it gently on the small table between them. "This crystal contains the founding myth of the Velnari," Soral said with a soft pride in his voice. "It is 12,040 years old, the oldest recorded story in the galaxy." He waited for her reaction. He expected awe, perhaps a small gasp. He had seen many young species express wonder at this number. Instead, Captain Holt simply nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something polite but ordinary. "That is a beautiful artifact," she said gently. "Thank you for sharing it." Soral blinked. He had not expected such a calm response. Perhaps the translation matrix had failed to convey the meaning of 12,000 years. He decided to explain further. "You may not realize, Captain, but 12,000 years is a very long time. Your own species, I understand, has only recently developed deep space travel. Our records stretch back to the very dawn of civilized memory." Captain Holt looked at him for a long moment. There was no rudeness in her eyes, only a quiet weariness. She reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a small data crystal of her own. It was clear, almost colorless. She set it gently on the table beside his blue one. "High Keeper," she said softly. "May I share something with you in return?" Soral nodded, curious now. She tapped the small crystal once. A holographic image appeared above the table. It showed the inside of a deep cave, with paintings on its rough stone walls. Animals running, hunters with spears, a handprint pressed in red dust. "This is a cave on Earth," Captain Holt said. "These paintings are 40,000 years old. We have older ones. Stone tools that humans made go back 2.5 million years. We have human bones older than your founding myth by tens of thousands of years." Soral stared at the hologram. He laughed gently, certain there had been a translation error. "Captain, I think the Matrix has confused our number systems. 40,000 is a very large figure. Surely you mean 400, or perhaps 4,000. Captain Holt did not laugh. She tapped the crystal again. The image changed. New numbers floated in the air, with scientific markings Soral recognized from his own laboratories. Radiometric dating signatures. Carbon decay measurements. The methods were the same the Velnari used to date their own oldest stones. "No, High Keeper," she said quietly. 40,000. And those are only the paintings we have found. The species itself, our oldest ancestors who walked upright and made fire, goes back nearly 2 million years. Soral's mouth opened slightly. He looked at the blue crystal in his hand, then at the hologram, then back again. His assistants behind him had grown completely silent. Veska, his oldest historian, took a slow step forward to look at the image. For a long time, no one in the Great Hall spoke. The dead red star outside the window glowed faintly through the tall windows. Soral felt something he had not felt in many decades. He felt small. He cleared his throat carefully and tried to smile. "Captain Holt," he said softly, "perhaps we should speak more, you and I. There seems to be much we did not know." Captain Holt simply nodded. There was no pride in her face. Only that same quiet, tired patience, as if she had expected this moment all along. Sleep would not come to Soral that night. He sat alone in his private archive chamber, surrounded by floating holograms of human history. The clear data crystal Captain Holt had given him was now connected to his personal reading station. Every time he thought he had reached the end of the human records, more files unfolded before him. 40,000 years of burial sites. He had read about that twice already, but the number still felt impossible. His gray fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled through images of ancient human graves. Bodies wrapped in cloth, decorated with simple beads. Children buried with small carved animals. Old men buried with the tools they had used in life. Each grave was dated with precision, each one older than the entire Velnari written record. Soral leaned back in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes. His chamber was quiet except for the soft hum of the ship's engines. He whispered to himself, "How can this be?" But the records did not lie. The science was sound. He scrolled further. He found images of stone tools shaped by human hands 2 million years ago. Tools so old that they predated the very emergence of the Velnari as a species. He found cave paintings, careful depictions of running animals and dancing figures. He found markings carved into bone that some human scientists believed were the earliest forms of counting. By the time the artificial morning light began to brighten his chamber, Soral had not closed his eyes once. He stood up slowly, his old joints aching, and called for an emergency meeting of his historical council. The council chamber was a wide circular room with 7 seats arranged around a central display. Soral sat in his usual place. The other 6 historians filed in slowly, all of them elders of his species. Veska, the oldest of them after Soral, took her seat to his right. Her dark eyes were already sharp with suspicion. Word of the human visit had spread quickly through the fleet. Soral activated the central display. The hologram of human burial sites filled the room. He spoke calmly, even though his voice felt heavy. "My friends, what I am about to show you must be examined with care. Captain Holt of the human fleet has shared their historical records. I have studied them all night." He played the dating evidence. He showed the radiometric scans, the geological layers, the scientific methods. He let the council members look at the records in silence for several minutes. Veska was the first to speak. Her voice was sharp and angry. "This is forgery, Soral. The humans are deceiving us. No species could exist for so long without our knowledge. We have explored this region of the galaxy for 8,000 years. We would have found them." A younger historian named Jorel spoke softly. "Veska, the dating methods are the same we use. The science cannot be faked. I have checked the readings myself." Veska turned on him angrily. "Then they have manipulated the data. They are trying to embarrass us, to take away the honor of our oldest stories." A third historian, an elder named Tammuz, raised her hand for silence. She was a quiet woman who rarely spoke unless something important needed saying. "Veska," she said gently, "look again. Look at the bones. Look at the cave paintings. These are not numbers on a screen. These are real things, in real soil, on a real planet. The humans have been digging them up for centuries. They did not invent these artifacts last week to fool us." The council fell silent. Soral watched their faces carefully. Some still looked angry. Others looked frightened. None of them looked comforted. "There is something else," Soral said quietly. "Something that disturbs me more than the dates themselves." He played another set of records. Images of human history scrolled past. Wars, migrations, empires that had risen and fallen on a single small planet over tens of thousands of years. Battles fought with stones, then bronze, then steel, then guns. A long, unbroken chain of conflict and survival. Their species does not remember being so old, Soral said. Most humans cannot trace their family beyond a few hundred years. They have lost most of their own stories. Yet the bones remain. The cave paintings remain. They forget, and yet the past still shapes them. The council looked confused. Veska shook her head. That makes no sense. How can a species be old without remembering it? Soral did not answer immediately. He had asked himself the same question all night. He decided he needed to speak to Captain Holt again, alone this time. Later that day, he met her in a small private garden chamber on board his flagship. The garden held plants from many worlds. Captain Holt walked slowly between the rows, looking at each one with quiet interest. Captain, Soral said carefully, I must ask you something difficult. She turned to him and waited. Do humans truly remember being so old? Do you carry these 40,000 years inside you? Captain Holt was silent for a long moment. Then she gave a small, tired smile. No, High Keeper. We forget almost everything. Most humans alive today do not know their great-grandfather's name. We are very good at losing our own history. Soral felt a strange chill. Then how does it shape you? How can a forgotten past still hold weight? She looked out the garden window at the stars. Her eyes seemed older than her face. Because the bones remember. The stones remember. And humans, High Keeper, have always been very good at making war and burying their dead. We forget the names. But something in our hands does not forget. Soral did not understand her answer. But it haunted him for many nights to come. 3 weeks had passed since the first meeting. The Velnari Archive fleet was now traveling toward a diplomatic summit on a neutral world called Ashen Reach. Captain Holt and her small crew traveled with them as guests of honor. Soral had requested her presence personally, for reasons he could not fully explain even to himself. He simply wanted her near. He had questions he could not stop asking. On the morning of the 4th day of travel, an alarm sounded across the flagship. Red lights pulsed along the corridor walls. Soral hurried to the command bridge as quickly as his old legs could carry him. Captain Holt was already there, standing quietly at the back of the room, watching the central display. A small Velnari colony in a nearby star system was under attack. 3 raider ships had appeared without warning. The colony had only one defensive vessel, and it had already been disabled. The colonists, mostly farmers and miners, were sending desperate distress calls. The raiders were Threshik. Soral recognized their dark angular ship designs immediately. The Threshik had been a problem for the Velnari for over 2,000 years. They were a brutal species, fast and ruthless, who lived by raiding weaker civilizations. The Velnari had fought them, negotiated with them, paid them tribute, and even tried to ally with them at various points in history. Nothing had ever worked. The Threshik always returned. Soral watched in helpless silence as the colony's distress signal grew weaker. His own fleet was 3 hours away at maximum speed. By the time they arrived, the colony would be gone. The civilians would be slaughtered or taken as slaves. He had seen this scene many times in his long life. Captain Holt stepped forward calmly. She approached the Velnari communications officer and spoke in a low voice. May I use this station? The officer looked confused, then glanced at Soral. Soral nodded slowly. Captain Holt sat down at the comm panel and pressed several buttons with practiced ease. Her fingers moved quickly, finding the right frequencies. This is Captain Holt of the Human Envoy. I am requesting immediate response from any human vessel within the Ashen Reach region. Priority signal. Civilians under attack. For nearly a minute, there was only static. Then a clear voice crackled through the speakers. The voice was young, almost shockingly young, but firm and steady. Captain Holt, this is the human destroyer Howard Dahl, Lieutenant Marin Voss commanding. We are 40 minutes from your distress coordinates. Confirming engagement. Captain Holt looked at Soral. He stared at her, then at the speaker, and then nodded slowly. Confirmed, Lieutenant. Proceed with full authorization. The voice on the other end did not hesitate. Acknowledged. Howard Dahl moving to intercept. Voss out. The bridge fell silent. Soral leaned closer to the display and watched a small green dot appear on the system map. The human destroyer was racing toward the colony at remarkable speed. He turned to Captain Holt. This lieutenant. Her voice. She sounded very young. She is, Captain Holt said quietly. She is 20 years old. The youngest officer in our active fleet. Soral nearly laughed. 20 years old. She is a child. She commands a warship? Captain Holt did not laugh. She watched the green dot moving on the screen. Watch, Highkeeper. Soral watched. The green dot reached the colony in under 38 minutes. 3 red dots representing the Threshik Raiders moved to engage it. The Velnari Bridge officers gathered around the display. None of them had ever seen a human warship in combat. What followed was not a battle. It was an unmaking. The Howard Doll moved like nothing the Velnari had ever recorded. The young lieutenant attacked the 3 raider ships with a strange aggressive pattern. She did not retreat to safer angles. She did not wait for backup. She drove straight into the center of their formation, rolling her ship hard so that her weapons could fire in multiple directions at once. The first raider broke apart within 4 minutes. The second raider tried to flee, but the human destroyer chased it down with a speed that should have been impossible for a ship of that size. The third raider tried to use the colony itself as a shield, hiding behind the residential buildings. The young lieutenant did not panic. She launched small, precise weapons that targeted only the raiders' engines, leaving the buildings unharmed. The raider was crippled, then boarded. The entire engagement lasted 40 minutes. The colony was saved. The Velnari Bridge officers stood in stunned silence. Veska, who had come to the bridge halfway through the battle, slowly sat down in an empty chair. Her face was pale. Soral realized that he was holding his breath. He let it out slowly. He turned to Captain Holt. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Captain, how does a child fight like that? Captain Holt watched the screen. Her eyes were tired, but there was something else in them now. A kind of sadness mixed with old, weary pride. To you, Highkeeper, 20 years is a child. To us, 20 years is a soldier who has already buried friends. Lieutenant Voss has been in active combat for 2 years. Before that, she trained for 6. Before that, her grandfather taught her the basics from the time she could walk. Soral did not respond. He looked at the small green dot on the screen, now pulling away from the rescued colony, heading back into the dark. He had spent 200 years studying ancient legends. None of them had prepared him for this. None of them came close. He sat down slowly in his chair and placed his trembling hand on the cold metal table. His mind would not stop turning. A child had done this. Word of the human intervention spread through the Velnari fleet faster than any official report could be filed. By the next morning, every ship captain, every council member, and every junior historian in the archive fleet had heard about the 20-year-old human who had destroyed 3 Threshik raiders in less than an hour. The bridge officers who had watched it happen could not stop talking. They described the human ship's movements in tones of stunned wonder, like children describing a dream. The Velnari Council demanded a formal report. They wanted to understand who these humans were and why their fleet contained warriors capable of such things. Soral was asked to deliver the official statement. Instead, he made a different request. He asked permission to speak with Lieutenant Marin Voss directly. The council reluctantly agreed. The young lieutenant was invited aboard the flagship 2 days later. She arrived in a worn dark blue uniform, the same color Captain Holt wore, but newer in design. Her boots were scuffed. Her short hair was tied back tightly. Her face was small and tired, with faint dark circles under her eyes. She carried no weapons. She looked, Soral thought with a small pang in his chest, exactly like a child playing at being a soldier, until he looked at her hands. Her hands were not a child's hands. They were calloused, scarred, and steady. She held them by her sides with practiced stillness, the way an experienced soldier stands when waiting for orders. Soral met her in his private archive chamber, the same room where he had spent so many sleepless nights studying human history. He had asked Captain Holt not to attend. He wanted to speak with the young lieutenant alone. Please sit, Lieutenant Voss, Soral said gently. Would you accept some water? Yes, sir. Thank you. He poured her a small glass and watched her drink it. She drank with the slow, careful manner of someone who had learned to ration small comforts. When she set the glass down, she met his eyes politely and waited. Lieutenant, Soral began, I will speak plainly. I have studied legends my whole life. I have read every old story my people have preserved, but I do not understand humans. I am hoping you can help me understand. Marin tilted her head slightly. I will try, sir. How old is your family line? She thought about it for a moment. I can trace it by name maybe 400 years. After that, it gets blurry. Just bones in old graveyards, places my ancestors lived. I do not know most of their names. Soral nodded slowly. And how did you learn to fight? My grandfather taught me. He taught me how to hold a knife when I was 6, how to shoot when I was 9. He learned from his grandfather. We have always taught the children. It is something we do. Why? Marin looked surprised by the question. She thought about it carefully. Because someone always comes, sir. In every generation, someone always comes for what we have. So we teach the children to fight before they are old enough to be afraid. Soral let her words settle in the room. He had spent his life believing that age brought wisdom and peace. The Velnari had not fought a major war in 3,000 years. They had grown comfortable with their long memories and their carefully preserved stories. He looked at this young human girl, barely more than a child by his standards, and saw something he had never imagined could be passed from one generation to another. Lieutenant, he said carefully, I have read 40,000 years of your history. I have seen the burial sites. I have seen the cave paintings. Your species is older than any civilization I know, and yet you forget so much. You do not remember your own ancestors. How can you carry so much weight if you do not remember it? Marin was quiet for a long time. She looked down at her hands. She turned them over slowly, palms up. She looked at the small scars and calluses. Then she looked back at Soral. Sir, I think you have it backwards. How so? Humans do not carry history. History carries us. Soral leaned forward slightly. Explain this to me. Marin took a slow breath. She seemed to be searching for the right words in his language. Every soldier who ever fell, every farmer who ever defended his field, every mother who ever protected her child, every grandfather who ever taught his grandson how to fight, all of them are still here. They are in my hands. They are in the way I move, the way I think. I did not choose any of it. It was given to me before I was born. Soral felt cold. He wanted her to stop talking. He also wanted her to keep going. That is why I am dangerous, sir. That is why all of us are. We are never just one person standing in a room. We are every ancestor who ever refused to lie down. Every one of them. All the way back to the cave paintings you saw. They are still fighting. They use my hands now. When I am gone, they will use someone else's. Soral was silent. Outside the chamber window, the stars moved slowly past. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, slow and old. Lieutenant, he whispered, do you ever feel afraid? Marin gave a small, sad smile. It was the same smile Captain Holt had given him on the first day. All the time, sir. But the ones who came before me were afraid too. They fought anyway. So I fight anyway. She finished her water, set the glass down gently, and stood up. Will that be all, High Keeper? Soral nodded slowly. He could not find any more words. She bowed politely and left the chamber. For a long time, he sat in his chair and stared at his old gray hands. They had only ever held data crystals. 11 Threshic warships dropped out of jump space at the edge of the Ashen Reach system. The Velnari sensors detected them within seconds. Soral was in his chamber when the alert came through, reviewing the conversation he had recorded with Lieutenant Voss 2 nights before. He had been listening to her words over and over, trying to understand them. The alarm tore him from his thoughts. He hurried to the command bridge. The Velnari fleet captains were already gathering on the central display. 11 Threshic ships. A full battle group. Their warlord, a fierce commander named Drava the Skullbreaker, was demanding the surrender of the Velnari archive fleet. He claimed the humans had broken a sacred treaty by destroying his raiders, and the Velnari were guilty of harboring the criminals. The Velnari council panicked. The fleet had only 7 ships. None of them were warships. They were archive vessels, designed for long voyages and historical preservation, lightly armed at best. The closest Velnari military fleet was 8 days away. They would not arrive in time. Captain Holt and Lieutenant Voss arrived on the bridge moments later, both fully alert despite the late hour. Captain Holt walked straight to the central display and studied the enemy formation. The young lieutenant stood beside her, equally still, her gray eyes scanning the data with quiet intensity. The Velnari council members began to argue loudly. Some wanted to surrender the archive ships and save the crews. Others wanted to flee, even though their slow vessels could never outrun a Threshic attack fleet. Veska shouted that they should negotiate, offer tribute, anything to avoid bloodshed. The voices grew louder and more frightened. Soral watched them all with a heavy heart. His people had grown soft in their long peace. They had forgotten how to face a threat directly. He turned to Captain Holt. Captain, we have only one human destroyer in this region. 11 enemy ships. What can be done? Captain Holt looked at Lieutenant Voss. The young woman did not hesitate. We can win, sir. The Velnari council fell silent. Veska turned and stared at her in disbelief. You, a child, against 11 warships, with one destroyer. With your 7 ships under my command, Lieutenant Voss said quietly, and the human destroyer as the spear point. Yes, we can win. The council erupted again. They protested loudly. They could not allow a young human to take command of the Sacred Archive fleet. It was unheard of. It was an insult to Velnari tradition. Soral listened to them shout for nearly a minute. Then he raised his old hand. The room went quiet. Enough, he said softly. His voice was tired but firm. I have studied legends my whole life. I have read of great battles and heroic stands. Now I am being given the chance to witness one. I will not let pride steal it from me. Lieutenant Voss has command. Veska started to protest. Soral cut her off with a sharp look. Veska, our oldest stories are about people who refuse to lie down. The humans live those stories every day. We will trust them. Lieutenant Voss did not waste a single second. She moved to the central display and began issuing orders in clear, steady tones. She split the Velnari fleet into 3 groups, assigning each one a specific role. 2 of the slow archive ships were sent wide, far from the main battle, on a course that would put them behind the enemy. 3 other ships formed a tight defensive cluster in the center. The remaining 2 ships, along with the human destroyer, took position as the leading edge. Soral watched her work with growing awe. Her tactics were not new. He recognized fragments of them from his own historical records. The wide flanking maneuver was something the Velnari had used during the Great Tide Wars 8,000 years ago. The defensive cluster pattern was older still, a formation Velnari ships had abandoned long ago because it required too much coordination. The young human was using strategies older than most Velnari traditions, but reshaped, sharpened, made deadly again. The Threshic fleet advanced with confidence. Drava the Skullbreaker had fought Velnari ships many times. He expected them to scatter and beg. Lieutenant Voss attacked first. The Howard Doll drove straight at the Threshic flagship, her 2 Velnari escorts firing in patterns the enemy had never seen. The Threshic formation broke into pursuit, exactly as the young lieutenant had predicted. They chased her, abandoning their careful battle line. The defensive cluster of 3 Velnari ships activated their gravimetric shields, channeling power through old systems that had not been used in centuries. Soral remembered now. He had read about this tactic in a history book when he was young. The Velnari had stopped using it because it was considered crude. The 2 flanking archive ships, far behind the enemy, opened fire on the Threshic rearguard. Drava the Skullbreaker realized too late that he had been pulled out of position. His fleet was now caught in 3 directions at once. It was a pincer movement, but not just any pincer. It was a pattern Soral recognized from a forgotten battlefield on Earth, recorded in human history more than 2,000 years ago. The young lieutenant had pulled it from her ancestors and brought it back to life among the stars. Within an hour, 6 Threshic ships were destroyed. 3 were crippled. 2 surrendered. Drava the Skullbreaker himself sent a personal communication requesting honorable terms. Lieutenant Voss accepted his surrender with calm professionalism. Then she turned and looked at Soral. Her face was tired. Her hands were perfectly steady. Sir, the fleet is yours again. Soral could not speak. He simply bowed to her, deeper than he had ever bowed to anyone in his long life. 6 weeks had passed since the battle at Ashen Reach. The Threshic raiders had withdrawn from the entire region, something the Velnari had not seen in 2,000 years of conflict. News of the human victory had spread to dozens of star systems. Other species, long quiet under Threshic intimidation, were beginning to lift their heads and look around. Something had shifted in the galaxy. Soral could feel it in every diplomatic message that crossed his desk. He spent his days in the great archive vault of his flagship, working on the most difficult task of his long career. He was writing a new chapter for the sacred Velnari Chronicle. The Chronicle had not been updated in over 400 years. New entries required the approval of the full council, and the council had been arguing about Soral's proposed edition for weeks. Veska had argued the loudest. She said the humans were not old enough to deserve a chapter. She said their 40,000 years of buried bones were not the same as 12,000 years of preserved memory. She said Soral was letting awe cloud his judgment. Soral had listened to her patiently. Then he had quietly cast his vote, and the council had narrowly approved the new chapter. He titled it The Year We Met the Old Ones. Veska had refused to attend the formal recording ceremony. On the last day before the human delegation departed for their home space, Captain Holt visited Soral in his archive chamber. She carried a small wooden object in her hands, wrapped in soft cloth. She set it gently on his table and unwrapped it slowly. It was a small wooden carving, no longer than Soral's hand. It was rough, simple, clearly made by a child. It showed a tiny figure of a soldier holding a round shield. The soldier had no face, just a small slope where the head should be. The shield was carved with a few clumsy lines, perhaps meant to be patterns. "What is this?" Soral asked softly. "A child made it," Captain Holt said. "On a small human colony, 3 weeks ago. Her name is Mira. She is 6 years old." Soral picked up the carving carefully. It felt warm in his hand, as if it still held the heat of the small fingers that had shaped it. "Why have you brought it to me?" Captain Holt smiled gently. "Human children have made these for tens of thousands of years, High Keeper. We have found them in graves dating back 40,000 years. The same shape, almost exactly. A small soldier with a shield. The materials change. The tools change. The shape never changes." Soral turned the carving over slowly in his hand. He looked at the rough lines of the shield. He thought of the cave paintings she had shown him weeks ago. The hunters with their spears. The handprints in red dust. "Why does the shape never change, Captain?" "Because the need never changes," she said quietly. "Someone always comes. So the children always learn to carve soldiers." Soral set the small wooden figure on his table and looked at it for a long time. He thought of Lieutenant Voss. He thought of her steady hands. He thought of the 40,000 years of ancestors who had stood behind her in that battle, pulling old tactics from forgotten graves and breathing new life into them. He stood up slowly and walked to the highest vault in the archive chamber. The vault contained the most sacred items of the Velnari people, the original founding crystals, the first carved stones of the Old Kingdom, items so precious they were touched only once a century during the renewal ceremony. He opened the vault carefully. He placed the small wooden soldier on the highest shelf, beside the founding myths of his people. Then he closed the vault and turned to Captain Holt. "Thank you, Captain Holt." She bowed slightly and prepared to leave. At the door, she paused and turned back. "High Keeper, may I ask, will the Velnari now consider humanity an old species?" Soral thought about it for a long moment. He shook his head slowly. "No, Captain. We will still consider ourselves the oldest civilization we know. Civilization is what we measure. But humanity is not a civilization. Humanity is something else. Something I do not yet have the words for." She tilted her head, curious. "What is it then, in your view?" Soral looked at the small wooden carving inside the vault. He looked at it for a long time before he answered. "Humanity is a long, unbroken war against forgetting. You forget your own names. You lose your own stories. You bury your dead and walk away. But the bones remain. The stones remain. The carvings of small wooden soldiers remain. And every child born to your species inherits all of it without knowing how. You do not remember the past. You are the past, still walking." Captain Holt was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, and left the chamber. That evening, the human ships departed. Soral stood at a wide observation window and watched them slip into jump space, one by one. The last to leave was the small destroyer Howard Dahl. He could see, faintly, the tiny silhouette of someone standing at one of its viewports, looking out at the passing stars. It was Lieutenant Marin Voss. She did not know that an alien civilization older than her wildest imagination had just placed her name into a sacred chronicle. She did not know that, somewhere in a deep vault, a small wooden soldier carved by a 6-year-old girl now sat beside the founding myths of the oldest known species in the galaxy. She was 20 years old. She was tired. She was looking at a star, thinking about home. And in her steady hands, 40,000 years of ancestors were still fighting. They would never stop. That, Soral realized at last, was what it meant to be human.